We're here with geopolitical expert Cyrus Janssen. We're going to talk about BRICS, NATO, wars in Russia and Israel, the future of China and Africa, and so much more. We're here at Nomad Capitalist Live. It's our big 4-day event. We hope to see you next year in Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Janssen, welcome to Malaysia.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here, Andrew.
You were just on stage and
Yes.
you said Malaysia was it one of the hidden gems?
Absolutely. I think it's one of the most underrated countries in the world. I think KL is one of the most underrated cities, and I think it has a very big, bright future ahead.
So this country, not so long ago, said we want to join BRICS.
Yeah.
So did Thailand next door.
Yes.
It's kind of becoming BRICS plus.
Yes.
What do you make of Southeast Asia now coming to BRICS?
You know, I think what we're seeing right now, Andrew, is we're seeing a tremendous amount of momentum around the world of countries wanting to align with the BRICS organization. Right now, we're about a month away from the annual BRICS President Summit. What that will be is all of the presidents of these nations are going to be meeting in Russia. It's going to happen a month from now, and they're going to be discussing a variety of things. Number one is what new members are going to be joining for 2025. We've already had reports that there's been 24 countries around the world that have formally applied. Malaysia, Thailand, like you said. Also another interesting one is Turkey, which of course, as we know, is a gateway between Asia and Europe.
And a NATO member.
And a NATO member, which is a very key point to bring up. And I think what you're seeing right now, Indonesia has also been speculated to be part of that. And they've, everyone is expressing interest. I mean, for example, you're going to have Erdogan from Turkey. He's going to be there in attendance. So he's kind of given some preferential treatment, saying, "Hey, why don't you, as the president, you can come into our president's meeting. I know you're interested in come into our meeting and let's have this discussion in Russia. We're going to talk about the future." And I think what you're seeing is this has become the chief geopolitical rival to the G7. They've already dominated in terms of population, GDP growth, economic growth, even access to oil and gas. They have much more access than the G7. So there's a big movement around the world towards this organization, people wanting to diversify, and the BRICS is certainly getting a lot of momentum.
I'm sure you and I don't agree on everything, but we talk a lot about the same things,
Right.
And that includes BRICS, and that includes, I just gave a talk, the death of the West.
Right.
It may not die entirely, but it's getting worse. Other countries are getting better, and yet you will hear people in the Western world say, yeah, this is BRICS. Look at Russia. They've proven not to be a superpower. The other two, the big ones, China and India, don't get along.
Right.
Who needs Ethiopia? This is a joke. What do you
Right.
say to that?
I think I always laugh at that because I think this is what, let's take, for example, a case study of Africa. The United States, we've never looked at Africa as an opportunity. We've always looked at Africa as a problem to be solved. And the interesting thing with that is that China has come in and they have said, look, you obviously the most resource-filled continent in the world. We all know that Africa is extremely wealthy. Unfortunately, with its history of slavery and then also the colonization, it has never had that opportunity to develop. But now China's coming in and saying, look, we're going to build ports, we're going to build airports, schools, hospitals, we're going to give you what you need in order to live a better life. And obviously that's going to increase trade. And the problem, the interesting thing is you might look at Ethiopia and be like, well, who cares? It's Ethiopia. Oh, who cares if it's Kenya? I don't care about these small countries. But all of a sudden, when you launch the Belt and Road Initiative and now you have 150 countries around the world that have signed up, that's a big influence there. And so it's one of those classic examples of they might be small pieces, but you start adding them together, it's actually very big.
105 million people in Ethiopia, and pretty similar in Egypt, which I think is...
Correct. Yeah.
You know who cares about Ethiopia?
Yeah.
Ethiopians.
Exactly.
There's 100 million, that's 1.25% of the world's population. And it seems to me, and I'm not sure what you think triggered this, the pendulum is swinging now to where people in Ethiopia are able to stand up and say, yeah, we want to care about ourselves. We're not just going to follow the existing world order, and we should be heard.
Absolutely. Well, I think that what's nice about this, and I think what China's done very successfully is, through their rise into becoming a superpower now, we now have entered into this multipolar world where you do have, in fact, the United States and China are both superpowers. Now, if you are a smaller country that's developing, like in Ethiopia, 100 million people, it's in your best interest. You're certainly going to want to have a relationship with the United States. You're not going to cut them off completely, but why wouldn't you also want to align with China, who's an absolute superpower? You're going to kind of play both cards. And if China's saying, hey, look, we want you into our BRICS organization, here's the tangible benefits that we can give you.
Yeah.
And you know what, again, the United States has no interest in that. The United States has no interest in developing Ethiopia. So if they're not going to get a voice from the US, well, China's going to give us a voice. Well, why wouldn't we align with them?
So basically, there are more options now available, and China has stepped up.
Absolutely.
You know, a lot of folks in the West, they'll say, oh, he's just the China guy. Cyrus Janssen's the China guy. He stands up for China. The narrative in the West is, oh, if you align with China, you know, they're no good.
Right.
They're going to stab you in the back. And there's almost like, we as Americans know better than Ethiopians what should happen in Ethiopia.
Andrew, you've hit that nail on the head, because this is an interesting tidbit here, is that the United States and China both host African summits, okay? And when the United States host, they only host in Washington, D.C., and it very much is a pitch of, you should not work with China, you should only work with the United States. Why? Because we're a democracy, because we have rule of law, because we're blah, blah, blah. So that's the message that is given to these African leaders. Another key point is that, you know, when Joe Biden addressed them the last summit, he said, look, this is what Africa needs, this is what the US is going to do, here's your solution for Africa. A lot of those leaders came away from that meeting and it's like, we're so disrespected. We're not a continent. I mean, we are a continent, but we're much more than that. We're 53 individual nations with 53 individual needs. Now you contrast that with China. China said, let's set up our summit, but what we're going to do is we're going to rotate it. So every other year, we're going to have once in China. We're then going to go to Africa, to your place, to give you that respect as well. This is something the United States never did. The United States never is going to host an Africa summit in Africa. We're not going to go all the way to Africa. You come to us. But China says, we'll go to you. And that's already a way of building a bridge more closer. In addition to that, when they just hosted the last China-Africa summit, China's government officials met with all 53 nations individually. And they wanted to hear, you know, Zimbabwe, what do you need? You know, South Africa, what do you need? Kenya, what do you need? You know, Ethiopia, what do you need? And so they had a much deeper level of respect. So African leaders came back and said, wow, like China actually listens to me, because what is needed in Ethiopia is very different than Egypt and very different than South Africa. They're all independent countries. Sure, they're united as a continent, but this is just foreign policy 101, treat people with respect. China's doing a better job than the United States.
And so basically, the world, I mean, the United States has quadrupled down on sanctions in this century. And yet now there's this competitor. And so BRICS is basically born of, you guys just think you can get away with everything, and we're going to show you that you can't. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think so. I think what you're seeing is, you know, sanctions really started to rise at the turn of the century. This was started really with George Bush and his weapons against mass destruction. And what's interesting enough, if you look at it, it's increased with Obama and increased more with Trump and increased even more with Biden. And now people have realized that, you know, first of all, the sanctions are not effective. You know, we're trying, you know, Russia, for example, has been able to counter all 16,000 sanctions around them. They've been able to do more trade deals with other countries. You know, they've increased their trade with China by 400% in the last 2 years. Even luxury goods. In my presentation today, I said I was in London earlier this year for business, and it was fascinating reading the Financial Times. Rolls-Royce has a tremendous amount of sales. Their sales to Uzbekistan is up 5,000% compared. Now, did Uzbekistan all of a sudden have this great money wealth? No, they're using them as a third party. They're selling to Uzbekistan, who then imports them into Russia. So they've found ways to get around these sanctions. They're basically no point. But what's happened here, Andrew, is that countries have now realized, I need to be more diversified. Exactly what we speak at Nomad Capitalist, right? I'm not gonna, if you're an independent, small, developing country, you do not want to hold all of your currency in US dollar. Because you step the wrong way, we're cutting you off from SWIFT, we're cutting you off from US dollar, and now your country is screwed. So that's where countries are like, hey, this BRICS thing sounds nice because I've got other options.
It was the best form of geopolitical manipulation in the recent times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just say, hey, get on our system, and then when we turn on you, you see it even with politicians.
Yeah.
You know, the president of Honduras, the day he gets out, oh, we're arresting you and extraditing you to the U.S. for shipping drugs here.
Right.
Tell me about it. You still live in the U.S.
Right.
Am I missing something here? I was talking to some of the speakers about this. All the politicians now, they talk about, we got to go after Mexico or whomever else for the drugs. Isn't it the Americans taking the drugs? Is there something like, is the whole personal responsibility thing gone out the window?
Oh,
I figured like Trump was like, he's the personal responsibility guy, and they're taking the drug.
Right. No, you're not. You haven't missed anything. I mean, that's just the United States right now. I mean, it's just a mess. I mean, there's no accountability. But I mean, it goes further because it's like, well, China's responsible for all the drugs. Well, it's like, well, it's actually the Mexicans that are, you know, play a big role in that as well. But it's at the end of the day, it's the consumer, right? It's the American consumers that want to buy those drugs. Supply and demand. Yeah.
So how big does BRICS become?
Well, I think what's very interesting here is that I think there's a tremendous amount of demand, but they have expressed now that they want to grow slowly. So, for example, this meeting that's going to happen in Russia next month, there's been 24 countries that have applied, and we're going to see which countries are let in. And they're going to do that gradually. They're not just going to, immediately have 24 new members. I mean, again, it started off as, 5 countries, slowly started to add. And I think they're really working right now as a, potential new currency is something that's in the works. But they're definitely going to operate on a new financial system, one that is really focused on trade and using their own currencies. So they're going to have a lot more currency swap agreements. You're going to see a lot of these countries that are basically doing more transactions without the US dollar. And so I think, how big does this grow? It could grow as big as they want. I think the demand from around the world is tremendous. The demand for de-dollarization is tremendous, and this is something that is going to continue to rise in the future because we know the United States is not going to stop with their sanctions and their, desire to be that global hegemon.
Do you think, as I say, it gets worse? The more they lose power, kind of like the girl you stop paying attention to.
Right.
It just has to get nastier and nastier. Is that what it becomes with these Western countries, or do they eventually pull back and say, all right, let's live with China and everybody else?
Well, my hope is that we do pull back and realize that, because unfortunately, these sanctions and these tariffs are actually starting to backfire on the United States. And the best example for that is the microchip industry. The US decided, we're not going to trust China. You can't buy our microchips anymore. So guess what? You guys are cut off.
And they figured they're just going to go and die.
Exactly, and it's preposterous.
We give up.
So like, what? China's just going to roll over and be like, oh,
right.
Sorry guys, guess we can't get any more microchips. I guess we're done.
Go back to the dark ages.
Yeah, no.
The U.S. says so.
So what happens though? I mean, you have a country like China that is graduating 10 times the amount of STEM graduates than the United States. So science, technology, engineering, and math. You want to bet against a country that has 10 times your amount of STEM graduates? I mean, we're talking highly qualified engineers and mathematicians and scientists that are going to dedicate this. And what happens is the Chinese government gives them the green light. If you are working in the microchip industry, you get green light, you get funded, you get tax benefits, everything. The Chinese government will do anything they can to help that industry grow. So what have we seen in the last couple of years? Well, we've seen that microchip industry has grown leaps and bounds in just a few short years. It's absolutely baffled Americans. Like, how can you be developing this fast? It's not possible. But again, you force China into a corner, well, they're going to double down. They're going to triple down. They're going to 10x their output because we have to. This is a moment of survival. So Huawei launched a huge new phone, and they had this advanced microchip in there, and everyone's like, how did they do this? And it was quite amazing is where they launched that is that the trade commissioner, Gina Ronaldo from the United States, she actually, as soon as she arrived right in China, they launched the phone, and it just basically blew up in her face because they're there talking about sanctions, and then all of a sudden the whole buzz in China was this brand new Huawei phone with the most advanced microchip, and she's kind of just left there, nothing to say. Right? Well, what can I say? You guys have figured out a way.
What's the number one misconception that the West has about China? Because no superpower can be that they're not angels.
No.
What do people get wrong?
I think the biggest thing is that people assume China is this place where there's no innovation. That the people are just cogs in this system, that everything is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. What's really interesting is that it's actually an incredible place of innovation. And what's so interesting about this, Andrew, is that if you take, for example, the EV market, a few years ago, China's doubling down. They're saying we want to dominate the future of EVs. So when they opened that up, there was about 500 EV companies that entered into the market, 500. But the local market is so cutthroat that about 400 of these companies eventually went bankrupt.
Yeah, this happens.
Right? But what happens is that the cream rises to the top. Only the best survive. So out of those 400 that failed, the 100 that made it really made it. And then within that, you have companies like BYD and Xiaopeng, and BYD now sells more cars than Tesla. But it's been tried and proven, and it's, again, this innovation from the Chinese. You look at what the Chinese are producing in the electrical vehicles, there is nothing that any Western country can build that's even close to the technology and the creativity and the design that the Chinese can do. So there's a big misconception that Chinese can't innovate, that Chinese aren't creative. Chinese is, they don't have that ability, but a simple look in the EV industry proves that theory completely wrong.
The late Charlie Munger, I think,
Yes.
upset a lot of people by saying, I don't want to buy Tesla because Elon Musk took shots at Warren Buffett. But he said, I think BYD is the stock to buy.
Yes.
And that was blasphemy in some circles.
Well, what's so interesting is that he doubled down on that comment years later, and he said, in all my history here at Berkshire Hathaway, investing in BYD was the single best decision I
Really?
did for the company. Because they've made an unbelievable amount of money on that deal. And he said BYD was my single best investment decision for Berkshire Hathaway.
China was very much in favor, earlier this century.
Yes.
Now people are writing it off, and
Right.
stocks have taken a beating there.
For sure.
I've seen, my own portfolio, bought some stuff at lows, and
Right.
it has come back to some extent.
Right.
But what do you say about that Chinese, stock market, and has it fallen into favor? Is the party over? It sounds like you're saying it's not.
I still think there's opportunity there, but what has shifted a lot here, Andrew, is that China's market, and I think a lot of sectors, for example, real estate. What's happened is you've seen a market that has matured. I actually bought investment property in China as an American citizen, many years ago, starting in 2009, and at that time, this was a great place to invest because property prices were increasing, anywhere from 50 to 70% every year. It was ridiculous. It was this period of rapid growth. And I remember talking to one of my clients who was a big Chinese investor, and he's like, honestly, don't sweat it, Cyrus. Pick anywhere, buy anything. It's going to just skyrocket in value in the next 5 years. You're not going to lose money. Like, I'll put my money on it. I'll guarantee it. Just buy an apartment. It's going to go up because it was at a different time. Again, this was 15 years ago. But now that market has matured. And so it's very similar, I think when people say, hey, the Chinese economy, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's definitely slowed down. There's definitely some contraction there. But it's just because China's economy is not growing at that double-digit pace that it used to back, 15, 20 years ago when it was still this breakout country. So I think you're just seeing a maturing of a market. But I mean, you look at companies like an Alibaba. I mean, it is still a dominant player in China, and it's going to be a dominant player, and it has a very pivotal role in Chinese life. So it's not going anywhere.
It does seem China does infrastructure better than all these other countries.
Right.
I mean, for all the talk of democracy, and sure, that's great.
Right.
It does seem like in a democracy, it takes 20 years to build a tunnel.
Absolutely.
And they build it faster.
I mean, there's certain advantages to China's government style, and I'm not here to say that, hey, China's government is the model to follow, it's the best.
Right.
I like to look at things objectively, and I think there's certain aspects of every government you could take away and learn from. But one of the great advantages is when China says, we are going to build a high-speed rail network. Now, at the time, 2007, there was none. And a lot of experts, they said, you can't do that. Right? High-speed rail works in Europe because the countries are small. It could work in a country like Japan and South Korea. Those are smaller places. But China's massive. I mean, it's a huge country. It's one of the biggest countries in the world. Countries like Russia and the United States, Canada, China, these are the biggest 4 countries in the world in terms of land size. But China said, well, we can do it. We can figure it out. And they did. They built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and it has transformed how the entire society functions. And again, a lot of people criticize that. They said, well, you're going to spend all this money, it's never going to become profitable. And the latest reports came out, I mean, it's actually become turned a profit for the first time. Obviously, you build 40,000 kilometers of rail, it's not going to be profitable year one, but you're making an investment into your infrastructure, and it's changing how society and how business functions. It's been one of the most incredible experiences. It's my preferred transport when I go to China. Riding the high-speed rail is phenomenal.
Would you live in China full-time? Would you feel comfortable doing that?
I definitely would. I mean, I lived in China full-time for 10 years. Many people do ask me, why did you move back to the United States? The big reason for me personally was just to be closer to my parents as they're getting a bit older in age. And so I want to be closer to them. We have 3 children. We want them to be a little bit closer. But as my parents kind of enter their last decade of their life, we need to be with them and spend as much time with them. But what we do is every summer we go back to China. We spend the summertime in China. My wife and I have permanent residency in Hong Kong, so we go back to Hong Kong, and so we have options to go back. So I mean, it's very, very much stay connected between the two. But I do see myself in the future, with my parents' situation and how that goes. I could definitely see us moving back to Asia at some point for sure.
Would you ever take the Hong Kong passport, Hong Kong SAR? If you had to give up the U.S. passport, after 7 years, if you lived there, you could theoretically do that. Would that be a trade you would make?
I think for the time being with my parents there, I like having the U.S. citizenship. I mean, I have a Canadian, I have a German citizenship, I'm U.S. Actually, interesting enough, my daughter was born in Hong Kong, so she actually does have Hong Kong citizenship. So it's a little harder for Westerners to get that passport. It's a very special case in order for you to get that. Within 7 years, you get permanent resident, but to actually get a passport, it's a little bit harder to get.
People do get it though.
People do get it. Yeah, it's just a little bit harder. To be honest, yeah, I would be willing to trade because the Hong Kong passport is one of the best in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could go to the U.S. as a Canadian.
Oh yeah, true.
Although, do you think you've pissed them off? Do you think that you're on some list because you talk about stuff they don't, and you're spreading the word?
I don't think I am. But what I do know is that I have several Canadian friends that, for example, were born in the United States because their parents were working there. And I've heard that once you renounce U.S. citizenship, it's very difficult. Like they're going to give you a bit of a hassle every time you enter into
If you're
the country.
Canadian, I think not so much.
Yeah, it depends though. I'm not sure. So I think at this point, just because I'm traveling a lot, you know,
maybe if you're you and I, they give you the stink eye.
They might.
The average guy.
They might.
So,
Yeah.
are you telling me though on China, because you would live there?
Yes.
Are you telling me we shouldn't get all of our advice about China from some guy filming in the woods of Colorado?
I know exactly where you're talking about that. I mean, I think it's really important, and what I would encourage everybody to do is don't just listen to this video and say like, okay, I know everything about China. You know, go listen to a variety of sources, but you need to speak to people that are on the ground, that are really experiencing it, and that have been there. And what I would encourage everybody to do is get on a plane and go. I mean, when you go to China, it's going to open up your eyes to a very different experience than what you've heard in Western media. And I don't think you're going to be able to understand that until you do go and yourself. You need to experience
To
it.
any country.
To any country, absolutely.
Any country.
But I think specifically China is an important one because, and one of the best things the Chinese government has done is they've started to open up many countries for visa-free. So there's about 25 passports from the EU that are now visa-free to China. New Zealand, Australia, a couple months ago, now you're visa-free to China. And that's been the best thing because so many people have come. If you go on YouTube right now, there's a plethora of travel bloggers just going to China because now they can. It's very easy. I just buy a ticket, get there. And that's been a very smart move from China's government because people are like making these videos like 24 hours in China, not what I expected, you know. And so it's very different than what you see.
It was very closed up. It was very closed off to the West, at least, when I first went 16 years ago.
Okay.
And they've been opening up visa-free travel to a lot of places.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the U.S., even the U.S., you get a 10-year visa.
Yeah, I have a 10-year visa right now to China, and interesting enough, I can enter in and stay 6 months at a time. So it's an extremely great visa. You know, I could spend a lot of time in China.
What do you say on the other side, though? People say social credit score.
You know what's the most amazing is it speaks to the volume of propaganda because the social credit score does not exist in China in the terms of that has been presented to us. So this really shows you how effective U.S. propaganda has become. Because the social credit score is actually, in most of the cases, actually applies more to companies than it does individuals. And it's actually more similar to your credit score like we would have in the United States, like your FICO credit score. It's not this system where, okay, if you jaywalk across the street, the security camera is scanning your retinas and oh, Andrew's now down 100 points. Guess what? Mr. Henderson can't be getting on a bus now anymore. It doesn't work anything like that. And you can go on the streets. This has been debunked so many times. There's videos that are hilarious on YouTube where people are going around, asking Chinese people, tell me about the social credit score, and half of them don't even know what the hell you're talking about. You know, what are you talking about? That doesn't even make sense. So again, that has really nothing to do with society, but it's another lie that's been really propagandized to us in the West.
Xi Jinping, shared prosperity. We are here at Nomad Capitalist Live.
Yes.
How do you make sense of that?
You know, I mean, this is where I'm a little bit worried about China in the sense of, you know, I'm for one, I'm not a big fan of unlimited terms. And, you know, I know that Xi Jinping a few years ago got rid of term limits. He's now effectively ruler for life. I'm not a fan of that. I'm very vocal about that point. But I think with this shared prosperity, it's an interesting concept because it always on paper works nice, right? And I mean that's communism, right? Like let's all share, let's all grow together, you know. The tide rises all boats, right? Like we're all going to get better together. But in reality, I mean, China was able to become the superpower because it embraced these capitalistic measures, and so I'm not a big fan of it in the sense that I think it doesn't encourage that entrepreneurial spirit that is needed. And the simple reality is there's going to be people that are going to work harder. There's going to be people that are smarter, and there's going to be different levels of society, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, I don't think that having everybody on the same page that is not going to inspire innovation and things like that.
And yet he's the face of China.
Yes,
he's the politician.
For sure.
Don't a lot of politicians in the U.S. and Western countries say essentially the same thing? Shared prosperity.
I think so. I mean,
In different ways, maybe.
Yeah, in different ways. I mean, I think what's interesting is you see a lot of these Western leaders. I think what's more interesting is I find more of these Western leaders would like to emulate Xi Jinping and have that rule for life. You know, I think a Donald Trump would love to rule for life. We saw in France, Macron, I mean, he basically denied the election results for several months. Yep. He's now installed, the government that he was supposed to install is essentially just his close allies. So all the French people are revolting, saying, this is not what we voted for. This is the most undemocratic process we've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And you essentially staged a coup on the government. You know, we voted against you and you've put in people that are your allies.
If they did it in El Salvador, as the president there says, yeah, it'd be world front page news. Absolutely. And they'd be sanctioned and they'd be all kinds of problems. But if they do it in France, it's okay. Are you anti-Trump?
I do not think that Trump is the change that America needs to see. I think what's the problem is with Trump is I think the most dangerous thing that he did is, I think, when he denied the election results in 2020, I don't believe that the election was stolen, for example. I think that really opened up a very messy can of worms that we're looking at now in the United States where, you know, for example, if let's just say Kamala Harris wins this election, I think that you will see a tremendous amount of people, including Donald Trump himself, revolt. And I think it just shows you how fragile the state of democracy is in the United States right now. So I think for the future of the Republican Party, I would say that the quicker that they can close this chapter of Trump and get somebody in there younger and with a breath of fresh air, I would favor that.
The concern I have about China is China becomes a stand-in for, we're talking about BRICS, any of those countries. And if Malaysia joins BRICS, you know, Malaysia to me, multicultural, very open, pro-immigration, you know, relatively tax-friendly.
Yes.
You know, China might be more on the extreme side, and yet there are these countries joining where you could go and live.
Right.
I'm curious to hear your idea of, you know, getting a BRICS citizenship as a backup plan, or getting, as you have, a residence permit somewhere. What do you think about that for a Westerner?
You know, I think it's a great idea. I mean, you know, for example, I have many friends that are permanent residents in China. I mean, actually, what's incredible, there's actually some really great opportunities for businesses, even in China. I have a good friend of mine, he's Canadian. He's become a permanent resident in Shenzhen, and him and his wife have opened a very small company. And there's a law there that if it's open, if you have at least one Chinese national in that company, if you earn less than 1 million renminbi, which is around 150,000 US dollars, if that company generates that money or less, your tax rate is 5%. And so that what they're trying to do is they're trying to encourage really small businesses. Like if you want to just have a kind of a side hustle or something like that. And so for him, for example, he works as a private golf coach. He just kind of teaches lessons here and there. You know, their company generates around $100,000 a year, and he's like, hey, that's great. Like my cost of living is so low here. I actually live in Shenzhen, which is a world-class city, and I pay 5% tax. And I'm very happy because my wife is Chinese. We're here in Shenzhen. We're doing our thing. So I think the chance for a Westerner to establish a residency, have at least maybe a citizenship, I think it's a great thing. I mean, Nomad Capitalists, we're all about options, right? Yeah. It's all about options and exploring and approaching things with an open mind and just realizing that the future of our world very much is a multipolar world where, you know, every country in the world now wants options. And so if the governments are wanting options, I think citizens and normal people should have options too.
For sure. And so let's talk about the dollar, because you mentioned in this BRICS world, they're not going to have a BRICS currency, would you imagine?
There's speculation, but I said that in my speech today. I mean, it's very hard to just build a currency out of nowhere. I mean, that's many, many years in the pipeline. I think what you're going to see more is trade in their respective currencies and doing currency swaps. Basically trying to trade outside of the US dollar.
So what we've already seen, also since the turn of the century, share of US dollar in reserve currency was from the 70s down to the 50s.
Yeah, so I think 74% down to 59%, something like that.
50, yeah. And so you imagine that just keeps kind of getting eaten away as, you know, the Japanese yen went from 2 to 4%, maybe whatever, it goes from 2 to 4%. How do you see that playing out?
Well, again, I mean, it's something that's very interesting because, you know, I'll give you an example. In the Wall Street Journal at the end of last year, they gave a report that just said, for the first time in history, 20% of the world oil sold in 2023 was done in non-dollar currencies. And this was a headline in the Wall Street Journal, and I guarantee a lot of Americans just said, nah, I don't care. Who cares? It doesn't affect me. I don't care. But what we have to remember is that the U.S. dollar had a 100% monopoly. Like all oil was sold on U.S. dollars, and now you're talking 20%. That's a big shift. That's a shift that should be raising eyebrows. That's a shift that say, hey, something's going on here. And I think one of the financial experts that I like is a gentleman by the name of Richard Turin. He wrote a book called Cashless, talking about China's digital currency and what's happening. What's interesting, he just said de-dollarization is going to happen very slowly, and then all of a sudden, all at once. And all of a sudden, you're going to just see all of these things happening, and a lot of people in the West are going to miss this. But again, that's a classic example. 20% of these oil trade last year was done in non-dollar currencies, but that's going to increase. Maybe next year it's going to be 25, then 30, and it's going to just slowly ticker on. And then all of a sudden, you're going to have a tipping point where, oh wow, it's 51%. There's more in non-dollar than dollar, and then
it sneaks up on you.
It sneaks up on you, and people are sleeping right now.
That is something. I think it's a lot of the West, maybe Americans a little bit more so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to your point, why do I care about that?
Right.
Is that their downfall?
It's definitely their downfall, and I think it comes, Andrew, from a cultural perspective. I mean, you and I know the United States, and most people are not cultured. Most people do not care about anything that's happening outside of the borders of the United States. Even, I think what's more interesting that I've learned from the United States is you're even more like localized, right? Like you typically don't even know what's going on outside of your state, right? So the problem is people don't have this view. For most people, I mean, they couldn't understand what oil trade and different dollars and currencies. All they're thinking about is what's my favorite football team playing this weekend. And
no, for instance, most people aren't thinking about oil trades anywhere in the world.
Yeah. But I mean, I think what the thing is that I think what most Americans are not aware. You only know what you know, and for most Americans, they're not even looking at even global news. I mean, they're just really focused on their life in America, and I think that is a downfall.
NATO.
Yes.
Is there a BRICS alternative to that? Because you're seeing Turkey says we went in. How does that affect everything?
I think with NATO is an organization that is really losing a lot of credibility. I think it's losing a lot of popularity around the world. And you have to remember, like, why was NATO established? NATO was established to combat the Soviet Union. I mean, in theory, if the Soviet Union collapses as it did in 1991, what is the purpose of having NATO? A lot of people don't know this, is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was the first one that said, we want to join NATO. Like, we want to be an ally with you guys. I mean, obviously, the whole purpose of this was to fight the Soviet Union. Can you let us in? Can we be an ally? No, you're Russia. You're not allowed. You can't come in here. And I think as far as, an ally, a NATO equivalent for BRICS, I'm not sure. I don't know if they're going to go more of like a military route in that regard. But I think that what we're seeing right now is that NATO is very divided. For example, when you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, now you've got the UK and the US saying, hey, let's send long-range missiles to Ukraine so they can hit Russia. Immediately, Germany says, wait a second, no, we can't be doing that. So there's a lot of mixed signals. The Kremlin's looking at that being like, okay, your house is divided. You guys don't know exactly what you're trying to do. And I think that NATO's not in a favorable position at the moment.
Whatever you think about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine,
right?
It's always seemed pretty crazy to me that they say, hey, let's push NATO up where it is. And yet when, was it Equatorial Guinea or,
right?
Hey, China wants to put a port in Equatorial Guinea, and the US says, hey, you get a little close. I mean, where isn't close?
And this is the thing that, well, I think what's really difficult, Andrew, is, for example, we go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, we want to put missiles in Cuba. Okay, well, no, this is an existential threat to us, and we will not have it. You will not put missiles in the Western Hemisphere. That is a red line. You will not cross it, and that is the end. So the U.S. says that, and now Russia comes back and says the same thing. You cannot have NATO. Ukraine cannot join NATO. That is an existential threat to our existence, and there will be repercussions. Now, if you go back and you actually talk to very well, like for example, even former U.S. ambassadors to Russia, they're the ones that are speaking out on this, saying there's no purpose for this to happen. There's no purpose for us to push Ukraine into NATO. And there was a deal in early 2022 to stop everything. And unfortunately, it was Lindsey Graham who encouraged Zelensky and basically, you know what, don't take the deal. Let's just go ahead and fight. And of course, it's easy for you to say you're not putting U.S. troops on the ground.
Lindsey Graham continues a decades-long career of being right about practically nothing.
Absolutely. So I mean, in that remark, he's remarkably consistent. He's wrong on every single thing that he does, and he's a terrible politician. And unfortunately, the big loser here is the citizens of Ukraine. The people in Ukraine that are getting slaughtered, and the military that are getting slaughtered in Ukraine, and it's really for no reason. It's really unfortunate. This could have been avoided.
Do you look at the United States as the biggest threat to global security?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's no doubt about this. I mean, and you just simply look at our history, the United States history throughout the past 50 years. I mean, we've launched dozens and dozens of regime changes, military conquests. I mean, we've launched wars. I mean, the most ridiculous, I mean, there's weapons of mass destruction, the Afghan war. I mean, imagine spending 20 years and $2 trillion to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. I mean, it's just absurd. And I mean, even if you want to talk about human rights, I mean, you look at, over 1 million innocent Muslims were slaughtered on these wars against terror. I mean, this is all blood on the United States government hand. And I think that you see a tremendous amount of instability. And I think if you have to argue who would be a better world leader right now, you look at China, and you look at China and the fact that they have not been in a military conflict since 1979. They've been rising. They rose 700 million people out of poverty into the middle class. They are very much investing around the world, building infrastructure projects. I mean, look at the continent of Africa. What has Western countries done to improve the infrastructure and livelihood of people in Africa? Nothing. And contrast that with China, where when you deal with China, you get tangible results.
This may be far-flung, and I would imagine this is a while off, but who knows? A lot of the Americans, Canadians, Australians who are here, particularly the Americans, is there a future when they have some form of sanctions and they'll wish they had the second passport and the bank account somewhere else because now they're out of favor as Americans? Is there ever a time when that happens?
I don't know. You were far off from that, but I think I'll give you a better example. I think what you're seeing is these sanctions backfiring on the United States. And the best example I can give you is Intel. And if you've been an investor in Intel, it's been a very difficult year.
It's been a tough year.
Intel is the worst performing stock in the S&P 500, down 65% last time I checked. But the biggest thing is what many people don't realize is that Intel drives more of its revenue from China than it does the United States. So it's fascinating because so much of Intel's business has been built on China. Now all of a sudden you have basically, okay, well, we're going to stop you. You're not allowed to sell to China anymore. Well, what do you think is going to happen to the stock, right? Well, we're losing billions of dollars of revenue.
They think it only goes one way. We'll shut down China, but they'll never shut down our business.
They'll never shut down our business, but yet, you start losing billions of dollars of revenue. What's going to happen to that stock? Of course, you miss all your earnings, everything implodes, and so now Americans are frustrated. I met a Dutch man outside, just 30 minutes ago, and he said, ASML, Cyrus. I said, of course, ASML. I mean, it's the one, technology that you need to make advanced microchips. And the Dutch are the only one in the world that produce that. He said, do you understand how angry Dutch engineers are towards the United States? They are so angry at the US government that you are restricting us from doing business with China. Right. You are screwing up so many things. So it's going to start to more of a backfire, I would say. And I think that is more what I'm looking at for the immediate future.
It's one thing when your enemies don't like you. When your friends are calling you out.
Yeah, and that's
maybe you ought to listen.
And that's where there was a famous quote from Kissinger is, I believe it was, to be an enemy of a friend is, I forgot the exact quote, I forgot to look that up, but it's like to be an enemy of the U.S. is one thing, but to be a friend is even worse, something along those lines. Just saying that, I lived in Canada for 5 years, and my biggest frustration there is Canada has no backbone. Canada's leaders, they will, when the United States says jump, Canada says how high. And I said, you guys have to figure out, you got to make the best decision for you.
Mexico's doing a better job of that now.
I agree.
Not saying I like all the current politicians there, but right. Mexico is getting stronger at, hey, we got a lot of stuff down here. We're not going to just listen to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're doing more business with China.
All right. Cyrus Janssen, good to have you. Thanks for being in Nomad Capitalist Live.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.